Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Garcia, and I am excited for you to be joining us today. This is a fireside chat for our advisor community, and the goal is simple. We're going to talk about what we're actually seeing on the ground with SBLOCs, not rate sheets, not product decks, not theory, but actual real client patterns, real advisor behavior, and real structural mistakes. And today we've got Adrienne McCants, the managing director at Uptiq. We're excited to have her. She's got tons of experience with navigating securities-backed lines, mortgages, structured financing, and she sees what works, what breaks, and where execution risk creeps in. Adrienne, excited to dig in.
Thank you so much for having me, Jen.
Absolutely. So let's start with a really tough question. What are some of the risks that advisors are um, doing? For example, how do they decide between liquidation, mortgage financing, and securities-backed borrowing? And why do most advisors still make that decision reactively instead of proactively?
I think there's lots of different components to portfolio strategy. And what we see with some of the most effective advisors doing is using a combination of all of these things. The really nice thing about securities-backed borrowing is that you can set it up ahead of time. And so what we typically see is once an account is set up, it's typically used within the next year to a year and a half, where the client calls, they need something quickly, and instead of having to liquidate the portfolio, they're able to use that SBLOC. And that gives everybody a little bit of time and breathing room to then think about, okay, what's the best way to then structure this? Should I think about taking out partial mortgage? Should I think about a partial reverse mortgage? Should I think about liquidating some items? How then should I structure things? But we really see by having that securities backed line of credit open just gives so much flexibility going forward. But I mean, you also deal a lot with advisors on the mortgage side. What are you kind of seeing?
Uh, yeah, no, to your point, Adrienne, we actually are working with a client right now who has a nice property out in Telluride, Colorado. And what they're doing right now is they're refinancing that property. They're pulling out 2 million and paying a chunk of an S block down. So what they're doing is they're just spreading it out the risk where it's not all in one place. And that way their advisor just feels a little bit better about how they're floating that risk over between the S block, which they'll keep open, and now the property. So that's been something that we're being seeing a lot on our end.
And
So
that
absolutely.
probably, yeah, and that makes sense. And I feel like that probably gives that client a bit of dry powder going forward too. So then if
Yeah.
they do need to make another acquisition or if they are looking at an opportunity, then they have the money available to do it.
Yeah, and absolutely. And on the lending side, you can use an S block to use for, let's say, down payment, a paid portion of the assets. Lenders allow it. And so it's not, you don't have to choose one or the other. Sometimes a combination of both can be very powerful. So that's really good that we're seeing that on our end. But I have another question from a wealth management perspective. What's the biggest mistake that advisors make when they need liquidity? Um, like execution uncertainty, and how should they think about minimizing it?
Boy, we get urgent emails all the time from advisors where a client's coming in, they need a certain amount of liquidity. They needed it like yesterday, and now they're trying to execute on something really fast. So I think so much of this is just like making sure the pre-work is in place. If you're able to already have a securities backed line of credit open, it just makes it so much easier versus trying to get it done, for example, within 1 week, which is just a huge, um, just like a very short amount of time to try to make sure you're getting the client signature and your signature and all your docs filled in. And so I think that's just the biggest part is I think one, having early conversations with clients about what their liquidity needs are going to be that year. And I think most
Mhm.
advisors do that proactively. but there's always surprises. And I think especially when we think about like parents providing a down payment for their children's home, for example,
Yeah.
or grandparents doing that. Um, all of those pieces, I think, is where we see, uh-oh, like there's a bit of a timing issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that on my end as well, right? When someone's buying a home and that home's coming out in the market in New York in a week, can we get pre-approval right away? And how is that down payment going to come in? Like, looks like they do have assets, but they don't want to get them or liquidate them. Instead, an S block would be really helpful. And so if they're want to prepare, especially if they're house shopping or thinking of buying something soon, then like you said, it would be a great idea for them to get ahead of it and not wait very last minute because it may affect future purchases too. Be it a home, be it a business, be it anything. It's just such a great idea to have one. Now, in terms of planning tools, you know, a lot of them assume that, financing just works, but in real life, underwriting fails. How should advisors incorporate real lending constraints into financial planning?
I think this is especially relevant for business owners, and for honestly real estate investors as well. And even for like VC, even for people who are partners in firms, like that's where we see, hey, look, maybe they had a relationship with the bank. They thought that they would be able to get something done, and then they can't. And that's where we see a lot of the like emergency actions too. And so I think this is a place where either, either like having a securities-backed line of credit in place or talking to us early about what lending needs are, um, makes it much more executable. I think early, like, cannot overestimate the importance that early has. And I think, Jen, I remember you worked with a client where, I mean, they were a very wealthy client, but they had a credit score issue, right? And you had to work with them to help improve that credit score before they were able to apply for some financing.
Yeah, absolutely. They actually were in a really tough spot, and thankfully we were able to get it resolved. But it all stemmed because they were purchasing a company, and it's a really well-known company, and they were just in the situation where I guess their manager that handles their finances didn't pay a bill on time, which was a vehicle that has a huge impact on FICO score. And so it went from, almost 800 to dropping to below the margins of a high net worth client would expect to have a large home in the millions out in New York. And so we had to work with them, and we did a kind of approach where we did several steps to get him to a position where we can refinance into a decent rate by working with them, getting ahead of that FICO score, improving, showing that it was an error. But that took weeks of us doing that. So it would have been great, right? That he would have had maybe another solution in place in the meantime. An S block, I think, would have been wonderful for him to have at that time. But I'm just happy we were able to get it resolved. But I absolutely think that this actually will tie into my next question for you. How can a client benefit from this? It's kind of a free emergency liquidity line, right? But how will they really benefit? What would be like that worst case scenario if they had to open the line and never had to use it? Like, who should they bring it up to? Like, what would happen?
I mean, there's no negatives to having it open. Um, I think the hardest part is just sometimes doing some of the paperwork. And so, where I do see some really effective advisors doing it is actually when they're opening the accounts at first. Because if it's can be done when they're opening the account, then everything is just
Mhm.
kind of pulled together and it's a lot easier. It's just a lot easier administratively on everyone.
Right, because it's like expected paperwork, right? You're gonna have to go through paperwork anyway, so it just does keep flow, and I think less stressful for anyone to have to do it, I guess, when they need it. If anything, it's like insurance. You get it to prepare for a time, right? It's not something you want maybe or need at the moment, but you're just preparing for that emergency ahead of time. What happens, and can advisors still get paid on those assets? Like what happens with the assets when they're tied with that SBLOC?
Yeah, the assets are subject to the line, but they're still fully able to trade on those assets. They're still fully able to charge on those assets. And so all of that, those pieces are not impacted.
How does an advisor that's new to SBLOCs get started or, start that conversation?
Yeah, so there's three things I've seen work really well. The first is that they open an S block for themselves. I actually think we have so many financial advisors themselves who have S blocks open with us because they find
Mhm.
it personally incredibly useful. And I feel like on the mortgage side, you also have a lot of financial advisors who come through and do mortgages through you guys too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And then I
All
think
the
the
time.
second, yeah, I think the second part is um, then you're going to have clients where it's not going to be a good fit for. I mean, somebody who is very adverse to debt, they're out. Like you don't need to have that conversation. Somebody who's like, I don't know, who has a ton of alternatives, like that's not going to be the best portfolio for this. We have other alternative lending lines that are, and like maybe we can talk about that in another webinar. But
Sure.
the other way I see it is like, so you open it up for yourself first, then you pick your top sort of 3 to 5 clients that you're really close with. You say, okay, I want to try to open it up for you guys. You know, let me do those first. And
Mhm.
then from there, we see people opening up for any new clients that come on board, and then slowly sort of going through their book and saying, who else would be really good who might have a liquidity crunch within the
Right.
next few years? Because that's
Right.
always going to come up a lot earlier than it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. And then right now, there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, we've seen the Middle East conflict impact rates on the lending side. So I
Yeah.
can imagine what businesses are going to get affected, what other, emergencies some of these clients should prepare for because we don't know, right? And so this is part of that review that a advisor might have at this time just to, it's tax season as well. That's always a good time to review, but just also prepared with that unknown. Is there an emergency for an unknown, depending what type of businesses their clients have, right? And so I can see that being a very powerful sort of tool in their arsenal as they manage their clients' assets.
I think that's such a good point. In my former work where I was working with somebody who had come over from AQR, and we were doing a ton of quantitative analysis on
Mhm.
drawdowns and the timing of drawdowns. I think this is a really good example of if if there is some sort of market fall and somebody needs a liquidity event then, and they don't have an S block open, it is so much more impactful to their portfolio versus being able to leave those funds in the market and then taking a line on those. Um, I just think I mean, it takes so much longer to recover.
Yeah,
I think that's a really
yeah.
good point. It's
No,
incredibly
absolutely.
impactful.
And one example that I can give that really hits home and it reminds me of this situation when we went through that Gulf War, we knew a gentleman that was owned a fleet of big trucks, like the big, and his business was impacted a lot because a lot of ports closed, prices rose for diesel and gas, and that was just a big, you know, impact it had on his business. And he just needed something to get through a couple months. And I could see this being just such an empowering tool that person that owns businesses might, have some savings already, but because we don't know any timing of anything, it'd be such a great idea to have this tool that they know they have in case of it, that emergency. But yeah, great talk. Awesome. Thank you, Adrian. This has been awesome. You've given us a lot to think about, and at least I know on my end, I've had a lot to think about. And as I encounter clients that I work with on the lending side for the real estate, I can see some need that they'll, want to explore on the SBLOC side as well. So I'll definitely, kind of send them that way. But if anyone has any questions for, Adrian, or any questions following up this, fireside chat, please let us know. Support@uptiq.ai. Thank you everyone for joining us today.